Okay, so another check-in video for you guys today, covering Korea Fire and Ice. We are right at the beginning of January 1951. We are at the communist activation phase. So, what's happened between the last video and this video is the UN forces pushed the communists back. We did not halt at the border in this playthrough. We went ahead and crossed, but we did end up because of our weakened UN forces, we didn't quite have as clean a sweep as we did in the first playthrough, and so there was a little bit of a delay getting the UN forces all the way up here. We did progress through, and in fact, we moved so swiftly. There may be some objective markers lost. When playing with my modified rules, because I am having it be, you can't place an objective marker in front of the most southern communist unit. Uh, I tried to figure out, well, how can I break that rule? And basically, the communists retreated north of Pyongyang. They didn't even fight for Pyongyang. They did not want to give up. They didn't want to stay in front of it or too far behind up this way. They didn't want to get caught. So they did what they could to retreat past Pyongyang as soon as possible, so the UN forces could not get it. And I think the carrot and stick is right there because the North Koreans are basically in disarray. They're retreating in the far north end of the mountains. Even if they give up Pyongyang, the whole purpose is to try to maintain something of a fighting force so that when the Chinese intervene, you're in better shape. So I'm not worried too much about that. I mean, you could see that as gamey, but the whole idea is it incentivizes the other side to just retreat, 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 where it doesn't make sense to hold ground. So you keep that sort of mobile uh, war going. And there's certainly a point where you could make use of the eliminate friendly units action at the end of the turn before VP markers are accounted for to actually remove units that are trapped down south so that you avoid that. So there's definitely, I think, a mechanism there to try to keep your opponent from getting too many objectives by just falling back and not making areas more important than they are. And I think that kind of makes sense, and I think that fits in with what Adam was trying to achieve with the victory point system. So the UN forces pushed way, way, way up. I had realized I forgot that MacArthur provides the UN player double VPs as long as the communist player is in the lead. And so I ended up correcting a few things. It lowered some of the communist VP a little bit. And then what was really important was them claiming objective markers that they had put into Daejeon and Seoul, and even some that they were trying to place over here. And they basically timed it just right. Because the communists had positive victory points even while we were pushing them up, that basically meant that the Chinese were not going to intervene unless we had like atomic release or something. And so the UN could actually freely cross the border and push forward because they weren't in danger of getting positive victory points until they wanted to. So in that, it's a bit of an oddball case, but I definitely think as the UN player, you can definitely manipulate it if you want to, right? It just all depends on how the game is being played. You could definitely manipulate it to force a late Chinese entry. The only thing was that was only possible because the communists had such high victory points from performing so well early. So I guess in some ways the communist player might want to look at the early game and just say, I don't want too many victory points. I don't want too many in the early game, because then it might make it harder for Chinese entry to occur. But however way it really hashed out here, I think the communists are feeling okay. But what happened essentially was in the last turn when we knew, okay, the Chinese are going to have to come in on January 1951 no matter what, that's when the UN players started banking their victory points. And it does kind of pose a weird question, like, does MacArthur's doubling affect every time you get the victory point? So, for example, I think we had the communists at like 12 victory points. We pulled off a 5 VP marker. MacArthur doubles that to 10. So that brings the communist victory points from 12 to 2. On the next turn, we pulled another 5 victory point marker off for the UN, and because the communists still had positive victory points, we still doubled it. So we got 10 victory points, which pushed us up to 8 victory points. And then because the communists asked for foreign aid, that just gave them one more, up to 9. So right now the victory points are 9 for the UN. So we went from, at one point in the game, like 19 communist victory points, now all the way to 9 UN victory points. The only question I really had was, once we cross that threshold, once we go from communist 2 victory points to 0, do you still double count, or is that modifier to the objective chit that you pick up, right? So I made an accounting and just said, well, if that doubling is lost partway through you accruing those victory points, then it's possible the UN player actually has 5 victory points instead of 9, basically losing 4 points if we stopped doubling the points we got when we pulled the 5 victory point marker off. I hope that's making sense. If it doesn't, I don't know. I got to try to think it through it. If I can find a 5 chit here. Here we go. Right, if you double this 5 chit, it becomes a 10, right? With MacArthur's doubling ability. But do you increment each victory point individually? If so, then once we hit 0, as we started adding victory points to the UN total, then we would have 8 victory points left. Or rather, let's see. You would do 1 victory point doubled, and then you would have 4 left over. So you would end up with 4 victory points. Yeah, I did the math right. So I don't know. The UN player potentially has 5 victory points or 9, depending on how you want to look at it. I think, like, you try to figure out, as long as things double count, well, what's the most optimal way to get victory points? I guess you go for the big ones because they count the most to get you over the lip, and then the UN player still has several objective markers over here, and over here that they can get now at normal value that can keep pushing them higher and higher into victory, or keep them comfortably in the lead. Though the communist player still has now multiple objective markers in Pyongyang, they still got some in Seoul down here. So if the communists can actually push and take Pyongyang, then it's going to be a real tug of war. And I think all of that is working to the original intent of the objective marker system, right? There's a little bit of a mini game. You're trying to figure out, do I place one? Do I reveal one? Or do I reveal what I can? Do I start picking them up and getting victory points? When's the right time to do that? I think that's the mini game that Adam intended. And I think with my fixes so far, they keep it going, I think, to what was designed, or what was originally intended. And my loophole exploit was only there as an unintended consequence of verbiage changing. But I think with the rule that I'm suggesting, I think that restores the intent of how the objective markers are being used. The only trick is, what happens if you completely eliminate all the North Korean units on the map? Well, then there's nowhere north of the last communist unit on the map to place objective markers, right? That's the one weakness in my adjustment, and I have a further adjustment to basically say, hey, if you've somehow eliminated all the North Korean units on the map, you're allowed to put objective markers in these border towns at the very border of China. That to give the players something to shoot for, and I think that should cover it. I think it's unlikely every North Korean unit will be destroyed in a campaign, but hey, maybe someone does something really stupid. The UN player does very well. You need some kind of clause in the rules to protect that situation. And I think by the time I'm done with this playthrough, I think I will have well hammered out that suggested change to the rules, and it should be pretty solid. So what do I expect to happen in the next part of the game now? Well, you can see I've done the Chinese intervention, the Chinese entry. They've gotten their free movement. They've gotten up in a couple of places up onto the UN line. The UN is now surprised, so all their stuff is flipped to its spent side, including HQs. They knew that would happen, right? I knew that as the player, and so what I did is I spent out all of my supply building prepared positions and trench markers along this line and some over here, because hey, if we're not going to be able to activate anybody, then we're going to at least prepare those positions, even if we're surprised. Now I realize that's a little bit of a circumvention of the whole nature of surprise. I prepared in preparation for surprise. I don't know. Hindsight's 2020. You have to do something. So the UN player decided, hey, it's not going to be very easy to get objective markers placed up here anymore. There's not many units. There's no more cities to place things in, and even the ports that we could put things in, the communists had retreated north of that, so they had no choice. They could try to have come up and caught and beat up the North Koreans some more to reduce units. That's the incentive, I think, is to try to remove more and more units from the board so there are less later. But I chose, and I don't think this is necessarily optimal. I think this is just what I wanted to try to do, is I wanted to improve upon what I did last game and create across this narrow part of the country a little bit of a better defensive line. And I'm using the river as an anchor point through here, and then the hills, and then some more of the rivers, and just the terrain. And wherever I think it's more likely that the communists will attack through, I put either a trench marker, spent supply points and build a trench marker in what I think are the most vulnerable hexes. And then I put prepared positions in sort of the next tier down of probably vulnerable, but I only have so much supply to spend. So I try to figure out the right way to make that work where we're denying the communists tank support wherever possible. And I did a pretty good job as the communists of keeping tank support, not losing tanks. Did a very good job of corralling my tank forces, so I have an ahistorically high armor force as the communists. I'm actually sitting at 11 tank support, 9 artillery support. Some of that due to foreign aid we just got. So the UN player needs to nullify the tanks as much as possible. They have basically a similar level of support. So they're just going to need to try to nullify what communist support the support the communists have. They got to hope that these trenches and prepared positions will do well. The Allies will likely retain an air advantage once we get out of the winter turns, but the winter is hampering our air capability. So really, all it's going to come down to here for the next couple of turns is, can we hold the communists down? Can we hold them back? And in the meanwhile, we're going to try to do what we can to remove these objective markers or slow down the objective marker accrual, so that, as the communists inevitably take Pyongyang, we'll have lessened their ability to get victory points there. And then, assuming that they do, and we get Ridgway as our UN commander, the UN will be in a much better position. And then they can worry about picking off their objective markers back here. All that's going to happen if we pick them off now is that's just going to enable the communists to build up more and more objective markers in Pyongyang, which they may very well take, and then they'll be free, basically, to get all their victory points, and that might bring them back over to the zero side. So it definitely feels a little bit like that mini game is actually there now, the victory point objective marker mini game, where before with Seoul and Pyongyang, the whole Seoul exploit, it didn't really matter. I had nullified the mini game. It didn't matter. Now it does matter, and I have to think as each side, like, okay, what makes the most sense? Maybe the communists aren't even going to put it in Pyongyang. They're going to put it in some of these closer towns now that they're closer. There's a whole strategy. We can put them all in one basket. And it just makes it easier to reveal and start picking them off later, or do we try to piecemeal some over here? I think it really depends on how much progress we make as the communists on this next activation phase, smashing through the Allied lines, if we can do it. And like last time, what I sort of did later than intended was the human wave assaults, where you stack fresh units and activated units in hexes, so that when they attack, you get the adjacency bonus of all these units stacked in a single hex. So you can get a bunch of adjacency bonuses you wouldn't otherwise get unless you could pile up units like that. The first few attacks last game, I didn't do that. I kind of didn't realize that's the right way to do it. I had instead let units get eliminated, and then I would move units up, and that was silly. This is definitely the most efficient way to do it. The only price will be if I attack, or if I fail, depending on the circumstances, the excess units will be eliminated. So it's a high risk, high reward action to say, hey, I'm going to do a human wave. I'm going to get all these bonuses on these deliberate attacks. They're going to go in. If I fail, or even if I succeed, there's a chance, due to advancing after combat, I won't be able to get everybody in a place where they can be in their own hex by themselves. In which case the excess units are lost. So, and in many deliberate attack chits, the advance after combat value is like 0 or 1. Not very many, usually. It seems like sometimes you can get a 2. So you're almost guaranteed, if you do like a deliberate attack over here, there's a pretty good chance you're just going to end up losing those excess units. But the game, I think, is balanced for that. It's basically, hey, the communists have this advantage. They can do the human wave attacks. They can get these bonuses, but you're likely going to lose some units. The one consolation prize is, if we look at the reinforcements on the turn track that I have set up here, there's still a boatload of communist Chinese units to enter the game yet. So they can be a little spendy with these units, and they can try to go for it. The only problem is they've got minimal infrastructure. The Allied bombing campaigns have been strong, so they're low on infrastructure. They can only activate so many HQs to make these attacks. So while we have a lot of strength, kind of just like historically, right, the communists may have a lot of manpower that they can use, but they are going to have supply constraints as we move forward. That's just going to be the nature of the beast as we play through. And so I'm feeling pretty. I think this playthrough is just going much better than the first one, because I know the game system. I know how everything works. I kind of know what's smart play and what's less good play. And without the exploit of victory points, the game has been much smoother, because all the actions I'm taking make sense in context to what I'm doing on the map. The objective markers make sense to where I'm placing them and where I think I'm going to put them next and get them. And we haven't had too wild of swings where like the Soviets have just randomly come in or whatever, right? It's still, we still have a lot of game left, and there's a lot of different ways that it could go from here. I couldn't tell you who's going to win the game right now. I think around this time last game, I was pretty certain the UN was going to win. Here, I'm not so sure. The UN is leading right now, but we are about to see, the final sort of flip in the game where the communists have an advantage, and then it's going to settle out into a sort of back and forth, tug rope battle for victory points and positioning, which we really didn't even get to see as much in the last game because it ended early with automatic victory. So it's interesting. It's interesting to see how this is playing out a little bit better. My conservative, position here that I pulled, instead of trying to push all the way out here, means we're not having a chosen reservoir fight. We're not out here in the mountains getting piecemeal ripped apart by the Chinese. But I think it's kind of hard. I think the one thing is the game's kind of missing a strong incentive to have pushed all the way up here, because you just have less options to put objective markers. So what can you really do, right? It just feels like you don't have that. There's just less reason to get stuck all the way up there. I'm not sure in a full campaign game, why a UN player would have guys way up here. Like I can't think of a reason why you would want to be all the way up there. You're overextending yourself if you do. Maybe that's just a like, hey, if you want to play the Chinese intervention scenario and you want to have your UN forces stuck all the way up there and you just want to play that historical situation, then the scenario is built for that. But in a campaign game, I just don't. I think that's you using hindsight and knowledge of history to say that's probably a bad move. You want to keep it. You want to have a more measured advance into the area. Honestly, at least that's what I'm thinking here. Because you can see I'm just barely able to create a solid line from coast to coast with a few reserves in the backfield. And it's likely you would, we could not extend our line very much farther if we tried. So there you go, guys. At this rate, we'll see how far I get with the game. I will do another, probably at least one more check-in video, if not the finale, the next time I do a recording. I just wanted to show you guys where things are at. So we're still technically, I guess, a little over halfway through the game. We'll get through winter, and then the really active part of the game will continue. And we'll see where we land on this one. I do think the rule changes that I'm sort of adapting here are beneficial. I'll say that much. I definitely think they're helping the game a lot. It has made this playthrough a lot more interesting and just more fun for me. So thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Take care, guys. Keep gaming.